brunch.
Yeah. I kind of like graze all day long.
Yeah.
So.
It's easier.
Yeah. Do you live on the east side of town?
No, I live like 2 blocks away from here.
Oh, do you? Oh.
That's nice.
Yeah.
Do you walk or?
No, I drive.
Oh, okay.
I would never get here if I had to walk.
Oh, really?
Not 2 blocks. I live on the other side of the freeway.
Oh, well then that's.
By the hospital. Yeah.
By the what hospital? By.
Like the Lovelace is right there on the corner.
Yeah.
By the freeway. I live like just east of there.
Oh, okay, cool.
Yeah.
You can skip out whenever you need to go.
Okay.
Or do you have class?
Yeah,
What time?
at 2.
Oh, okay.
So
I want to say we need
Yeah.
one to stay until.
I really don't want to go.
Especially today.
Yeah, that's what I'm like. Oh.
Doesn't look like any closures are happening.
I know. I was hoping that I'd get an email and they'd be like afternoon classes or
APS is still just voluntary pickup.
really.
Yeah, so.
I thought for sure they'd close, but I was thinking closer to 1 that they would call it, that APS
They
would
might.
call it.
Mm-hmm.
But
If it keeps it up.
I know. Where do
Sorry
your
about
kids
that.
go to school?
They
what
go
is-
to different schools. So
Oh.
my daughter goes to it's Covenant, not the big Covenant, preschool.
Okay.
My son goes to.
Our speaker today, this is a friendly reminder that the month of December, the group of us that
Montessori.
did the organization for this, the theme is trauma. I'm really delighted today to have with us Dr. David Schonfeld, who's the chairman of the Department of Pediatrics at St. Christopher's Hospital in Philadelphia. Just by way of educational background, Dr. Schonfeld got his undergraduate medical education at Boston University, completed his pediatric residency at CHOP, and then completed a pediatric behavioral and developmental pediatrics fellowship at the University of Maryland. Spent his early part of his career at Yale University, then by a long stint at Cincinnati Children's Hospital, where he led the developmental and behavioral pediatrics section there. Since February 2013, he's been the chair at St. Christopher's in Philadelphia. Part of the reason we wanted to have Dr. Schonfeld come and talk today, from my perspective, was what he has been able to do as a pediatrician on a national and international level. Currently, he's a member of the National Commission on Children's Disasters, the Disaster Mental Health Subcommittee of the National Biodefense Science Board, as well as, in this, for all of you, on the American Academy of Pediatrics Disaster Preparedness Advisory Council. He's been actively involved in helping children and families who've experienced disaster as far back as 9/11. Has been involved with problems like that, including the problem last year in Sandy Hook at this time period, as well as international work in disaster medicine relative to children's health. Will you please give a warm welcome to Dr. David?
Well, good afternoon. It's good to be here. And I'm going to start with I have no financial disclosures. I get no money, and I don't do drugs. So whether they're connected or not. So what I'm going to skip over the learning objectives, but what I wanted to cover in this time is really how do you support children after a disaster? And I'm going to be giving examples from national and international events, but I want to emphasize that it's the same strategy that you would be using if you're supporting a family that's dealing with a family crisis or an individual crisis. So at least 90% of what I say you can use today and tomorrow. You don't have to wait for a tsunami or an earthquake or a volcano eruption. I'm going to spend some time talking about some of the symptoms of adjustment reactions that will help you identify children who might be struggling, but I also want to emphasize that often kids will show no symptoms, and you really shouldn't be looking for the symptoms, but this at least will give you some sense of what are some of the symptoms that may occur. I'm going to talk about the timeline for adjustment briefly at the end, so you get some sense of what is the timeline for the recovery period. And I'm going to touch briefly on professional self-care, because I think it's important we figure out how to take care of our colleagues and ourselves. So to start out first with talking about psychological first aid, or PFA. So in the immediate aftermath of a major crisis event, one of the first strategies is to apply psychological first aid broadly to all of those who have been impacted by the event. You don't screen to identify people, you just provide it to everyone who was involved. And the goal is to give supportive services to foster normative coping and to accelerate the natural healing process. And all staff should understand the likely reactions and how to help children cope, not just physicians, not just nurses, not just mental health professionals, but really everyone that works in your system. So anyone that interacts with children can be a potential support or source of assistance if they're prepared, but if they're unprepared, they can actually be a source of further distress. So one of the things I did right before they opened the 9/11 Memorial in New York City, I guess that was about a year ago, I went out and did some training for a day with their staff. And it included their security staff and the people that took tickets there, because the issue is if you come and you enter a site like that and you've had a personal loss, whether it's related to 9/11 or not, and you're anxious about it, the person who greets you often can make a big difference about whether they greet you in a welcoming way or whether they say, if you come up and say, I don't have any place to park, and they go, well, there's no parking in in lower Manhattan, sorry, I can't help you, you have to move your car. If that's actually, they were just about to open for the first time, so if that's actually a family member of someone who died in 9/11, that's going to be seen as extremely unsupportive and that person will be overwhelmed. If instead you say, oh, I understand parking can be very hard, let's see if we can't find someone who can help you with that. It makes a very big difference. So when I went out to Aurora after the shooting in the movie theater there, I was working with the school system to prepare for the first day of school, and I made the point that the first face of the school system for those children on the day they returned was going to be the bus drivers. So they pulled all the bus drivers together to get psychological first aid training. So you need to think about that often individuals who interact with kids in a non-professional way may actually be getting their support from those individuals. So as an example, I went to one school, and one of the school cafeteria workers told me they noticed one of the children going through the trash in the cafeteria, and then by discussing it with him, found out he was looking for meals for his family. You really want that type of person to be observant. I went to another school that had a school shooting that involved a hostage situation and a child murdered in front of the class. And when I went and talked with the school cafeteria workers, they said, we noticed the kids are wearing long-sleeve shirts. And I asked, why is that? Why do you think that's relevant? And they said, well, they get on the lunch line, they hold out the tray, the sleeves retract, and we can see they've been cutting. But we don't think the mental health staff or any of the health staff in the school are aware of that. So they have different observations. They also have different connections with the kids. So in that school where there was that shooting that occurred, I also spoke with the school security staff. Actually, I'm sorry, it was the custodial staff. And while I was talking with the custodial staff, they mentioned that they were concerned about the students because they seemed out of control. And I said, well, what do you mean by out of control? So it's just a high school where the shooting happened. And they said, well, we were in the cafeteria, and some of the kids got up and they left their trays behind, and we reminded them and they kept walking. So we just stopped them and said, no one's going to clean up your trays. If you don't pick them up, they're never going to leave that table. So the kids went over, they picked up their trays, they walked to the door, which was to the outside of the building, and they threw the trays outdoors, turned to the custodian and said, are you happy now? It's not on the table anymore. And he just looked at me and he goes, these are good kids. They would never have done this before the shooting occurred. I'm really worried about them. And then he looked at me and he said, and I can assure you, they don't do that in front of their parents. They don't do that in front of their teachers. They don't do it in front of the school administrators. They feel safe in front of us, and we're worried about them. So the issue is the kids connect with different people in different ways, so all of your staff should be trained in psychological first aid. Because I will assure you that any time you have a hospital, probably at least 70%, I'm making that number up, 70% of the people are in crisis when they come here, even if it's just they're worried about their kids' health that day. And so you need all of your staff to be able to be supportive and helpful to people who come through the door. So that's psychological first aid. So let me go over some of the steps in psychological first aid. Main reason I go through this is as described by the American Red Cross, is simply to demystify it. A lot of times people tell me they haven't gone through psychological first aid training. I'm going to give it to you in about 3 or 4 minutes. And the bottom line is that this is just good medical care. And so you probably are doing all of this already. So the first thing is observation or awareness. I'll go over some of the common symptoms of adjustment reactions in a minute. Make a connection. Help people feel comfortable and at ease. Be kind, calm, and compassionate. Realize that people tend to pick up on the tone of how you speak more than on the actual content when they're upset. So if you appear calm, then they will feel calmer. I have actually had people delivered very bad news calmly, and I have done that myself. I'm told I'm very calming, and I've delivered really bad news and had people not get it at all. They just think everything's okay. So I delivered really bad news about a closed head injury in a kid that had an epidural and was intubated and hyperventilated, and I explained it very simply and directly, and the mother just wanted to know if she should go home or should she stay. No, she asked first, would the child need to stay overnight? And I was like, really? And it wasn't just the mother. It was like, did the same explanation to another family member who came in later, and I got the same question. Is he going to have to stay in the hospital overnight? And so I think the issue is, if we are calm, people are more likely to understand what we say, more likely to process that information. But if we're anxious or upset, even if we're upset about the patient beforehand, we're more likely to agitate the patient. We need to assist with basic needs. I'm going to get into that in I think it's the next slide. We want to listen, and you need to listen with comprehension. So sometimes people ask a question, but it's not really their underlying question. So they might ask something, but really you have to probe a little bit more about why are you asking that question, or what are you most concerned about. So when I say listen, you have to listen to some understanding of what motivates people. You want to give realistic reassurance. You don't want to give false reassurance. So you want to give accurate information, but you don't want to give excessive information. So you want to give accurate and timely information that's later down, but you want to make sure that it's information that's behaviorally relevant. So there's a lot of information out there which isn't helpful to people. Actually, while I was on the plane yesterday, I got a call right before the door closed from a reporter about the 9/11 tapes that were being released from Newtown. And should people be listening to them? And I'm like, first responders who are experts in this area should listen to it so they can understand better how to respond to a disaster. The general public has no value. They already know what happened. It was a bad outcome. They're not going to gain any insight about what happened by listening to those tapes. They'll only be reminded of the tragedy, sensitized, or will think back about when they've received bad news or when they've been part of a difficult conversation. There is no benefit for people to listen to them. And even though I was in Newtown and worked with them, I'm not listening to the tapes myself. I know what the calls were about. It wasn't good news, and I don't need to hear people's distress. So you want to give realistic reassurance, not false reassurance. If a child or an adult is actually concerned about something and you cannot reassure them by telling them that they've misunderstood or, no, actually it isn't a problem, then what you should do is stop trying to tell them they shouldn't be upset. Telling people that are anxious you shouldn't feel anxious doesn't usually work. The only thing it does is it makes them feel you don't understand where they're coming from. So if somebody is upset about something, you can provide some reassurance as appropriate, and then you need to move to encouraging good coping. So you're upset about this, you're scared, you're anxious, you're sad. Let's talk about some strategies of how you can help yourself deal with those feelings, as opposed to telling them that they shouldn't have them. Then you want to help people connect, and later down suggest a referral resource. And then the hardest part for most medical personnel is end the conversation. All of this should take place in about 5 or 10 minutes. So if you want to practice this, go to the elevator in the hospital. You might want to go over to the adult facility and watch when the doors open. If you ask people, is it going up and down? And they say, I don't know. That's usually a good sign that they're overwhelmed. Get in the elevator, do psychological first aid, and you should be able to finish it before they get to their floor. I would not do this too much, or it's considered stalkerish. You don't know why you're doing it, but you can actually practice the skill, and it can be very helpful. And I've actually done that in the hospital where someone looks lost, and I'll stop and say, what are you looking for? And they'll go, my kid's sick, and I'm trying to find it. Well, let me help you find that. Are you with anyone today? What's your child here for? As I'm walking them to their location. Maybe you could talk with someone about this. Have you reached it? Do that all. Get them to their location and just leave. And so I find that I can do that in like 3 minutes. And strikingly, families will look at you and go, I wish everyone were this kind. I'm like, okay, just help you find your room. So, the issue is people do appreciate that a great deal. So that's psychological first aid. The next issue that I said I was going to turn to was dealing with basic needs. And I tell this story a lot. When I was at Yale, I was helping plan hospital disaster preparedness. And I was in a planning meeting where they were talking about how to deal with a mass decontamination for a chemical terrorist attack. So they went through this whole tabletop activity, they finished it, and then they said, oh, that's right, there's the emotional part. Could you, and they looked at me and they go, could you tell us what are some of the things that you might want to ask to figure out what type of counseling they would like? They said, well, let me get the scenario right. You got 500 people, they're at an athletic event with family and friends. They are notified over PA system that they've been exposed to a chemical agent that they can't see or smell, but is likely to kill them and those that they care about with them. They are stripped naked and all of their belongings are permanently removed from them. They do not take your iPhone, wipe it off, and say, we've removed the sarin, here, it's back. So it's gone. So once all that stuff is removed, I said you now have 500 people unsure whether or not those they are with or those that they haven't been able to contact because they no longer have their phones, whether they are dying or might die, are in harm's way. They're cold, they're wet, they're naked, and they have no car keys, no house keys, no credit cards, no driver's license, no identification, no cash, no way to get to their home, no way to get into their home, no way to communicate with people. So I said, I know what they want, and I don't need a screening questionnaire for it. Psychic. So I found that I was working at a lot of disaster conferences and meetings at a federal level, and everyone spoke in acronyms, which I don't like, but I figured if I didn't have an acronym, no one would ever listen to me or think what I did was credible, so I made one up, which is what they do after all, and came up with the acronym UWF to stand for Underwear First, which is really what they need. And then for those of you, since I'm hospital administration, brief therapy is billable under Medicaid. So you can actually use a billing criteria. So the issue is you need to deal with people's basic needs before they're able to address any of their other emotional needs. And those basic needs are going to be around safety, security, food, shelter, communication, and reunification with family and other loved ones. And the staff have their own basic needs, and crisis plans really need to address them as a priority. We tend to think somehow as professionals that they can just take care of their own needs outside of what's going on, but they really do need, they can't put off the needs of their family and friends indefinitely. And I've seen too often the expectation of that among healthcare professionals, and it really leads to their inability to continue to do their work. So temporarily you do need to do that sometimes, but it's better if you have a crisis plan in place so that you know your family is taken care of, that your dog is not, that someone's going to feed your dog if you live alone. You know, you have to have a disaster plan in place in case you get stranded and can't come home. But you really can't expect people to put that off for too long. So one of the stories that I heard when I was in New Orleans on one of my visits after Katrina was that there was a chaplain that was in the middle of providing a sermon. And someone's cell phone went off in the audience, and there was a lot of kind of murmuring about how inappropriate that is for a cell phone to go off in the middle of Mass. At which point the chaplain just said, you know what, that might be your contractor, you better answer it. So the issue was, in New Orleans at that time, you couldn't get a contractor on the phone. And people were homeless, or they were living in homes that were not safe, or didn't have roofs that protected them and their families. And what the chaplain communicated was, you're here to hear the word of God, but you have to have a roof over your head for yourself and your family. And I understand that takes precedent. And I think what happened then was everybody just connected with the chaplain and was much more likely to think that he was an important person that had wisdom to share because he understood where they were coming from. So I try and emphasize to people that you do need to take care of basic needs. And I think increasingly in healthcare, we're seeing basic needs as simply impediments for timely discharge from the hospital. But we have to see them as really impediments to good health. And we need to help people deal with their basic needs. Or they're really not going to. I ran the lead program while I was at Yale, and I remember at one point I was trying to find safe lead-free housing for a family in a very poor area that was known for a lot of urban violence. And we had found a lead-safe apartment, and the mother wasn't going to go there. And instead of judging her, I asked why, and she goes, it's more likely he'll be shot if we're there, and I would rather take the lead on the walls than in the bullet. And so it's a conscious decision I'm making. And so the issue was then I said, we can't ask people to make that choice. It's not a reasonable choice to make. So we opened a shelter. We opened a lead-safe home instead to provide that. And we found dramatically improved lead levels as a result. when we were able to provide emergency lead-safe housing and then help people get their apartments taken care of. So let me go in. So psychological first aid and basic supportive services are the two key things that you start out with everyone. But now let me go into what are the symptoms of adjustment reactions that can help you identify kids that may be having more trouble. A lot of this applies pretty equally to adults as well. So the first thing is sleep problems. That could be trouble falling asleep, staying asleep, early wakenings, nightmares, frequent wakenings, any disruption in your sleep pattern. If it leads to disruptive sleep, ultimately it impacts their ability to function the next day. So in terms of management, we often find that the one symptom that you might want to do symptomatic treatment for would be around sleep. If someone is not able to sleep, they're not likely to benefit from most other treatments. So I do think you want to ask about sleep issues and try and address them. A lot of what you'll be doing, though, is around good sleep hygiene. So making sure they have a quiet place, all of the steps that you normally go over in pediatrics, if you can fit it into your 7 minutes of anticipatory guidance, you would want to make sure that you cover. The next one is separation anxiety and school avoidance. A lot of the kids who have been through difficult situations may be afraid to separate from those who they care about, either because they're afraid something will happen to them if they're not there to protect them, or that something may happen to them if their parents aren't there to protect the child. And as a result, they may start to avoid going to school. And so we really need to work with school systems to make sure that they reach out to the children who aren't there after a disaster. The problem is they're so overwhelmed with the kids who are there, and their staff are struggling, and often a lot of their staff are not there. And they also have financial issues that occur after most natural disasters, at least. And people are just not functioning well. So the last thing they really want you to tell them is, I know you're struggling just to care for 80% of the kids that are here. I need you to actually go out and find the other 20% because they're the ones who really need your help. That's a hard thing for them to hear, but it really is important. So how many of you had the opportunity to go out to New Orleans within a couple of years after Katrina and see any of their trailers? Did you see any of the trailer parks? Okay, so were the trailer parks nice? No, they were like horrible. So I'll show you a picture of one of them. It wasn't the one that I visited, but one I visited was actually worse. But monotonous asphalt, white trailers, all packed closely together. The one I went to had no playground, no lawn. It was surrounded by a large fence with barbed wire and an armed security guard. There was nothing you could even walk to for recreation. The only thing they could walk to was railroad tracks. They couldn't walk to a grocery store, to a laundromat. It was in the middle of nowhere, and it was horrible. High rates of domestic violence, suicide, drug use, gang activity in these trailer parks. Now, the reason and if you look at this and you go, a kid on the bicycle, he's having fun. That's a police officer on patrol. These were not fun places. So the reason I mention this is, when I was out there, I went to one community that doubled their population within 1 weekend after Katrina. They were a community right next to New Orleans. And they accepted the most displaced students. And they told me 4 months after Katrina, for all of the kids who had relocated and registered for school, the majority had not shown up for a day of school yet. They were here, and they were not having fun. So a lot of times people will say, oh, well, maybe they're just on vacation, they're goofing off. They're not. They're traumatized. And so we really need to recognize someone has to get into the trailer parks and get these kids back into school. And as healthcare providers, when the family comes in and says, my kid's having stomach aches, he's having headaches, I need a note, I want to homeschool him, you should really see that's a big red flag. And you should be working with them to get them back to school with the adaptations, accommodations, maybe an adjusted schedule. Maybe they spend a lot of time with someone, a counselor at the school, but they need to get back to school because a lot of times it really is a sign that they're having trouble coping. You can see generalized anxiety in kids, so they may be just more fearful. Not necessarily, you can have trauma-specific and trauma-related fears. So I had one kid in Sichuan province. The earthquake occurred while he was eating a meal. He wouldn't eat his meals indoors. Whenever it was time to eat, he wanted to eat outside because the building collapsed on them. That's kind of understandable to people. But you may also see the kids just are more fearful. So let's say the earthquake happens during the day. The same kid might be afraid of the dark. It's just a developmental fear, and they just become more anxious. So if you try and argue with people about, but that had nothing to do with the event. It has to do with the event causing them stress and then being generally more anxious. You can see troubles with concentration. I'm going to get into this in a little while, which also relates to a deterioration in academic performance. You can see also regression in kids and adults. When I was in Joplin, I was there the first day at the start of the new school year after the tornadoes that they had had. And unfortunately, there was a storm that day, so the weather was bad, and that wasn't a good thing because the kids were afraid to come to school, as were a lot of the parents. I had a meeting at the end of the day, actually I think it was in the evening, with some of the parents, and I was talking with parents beforehand. I said, how old are the kids that you're concerned about? And one mother looked at me and she goes, well, I have several kids. There are two I'm most concerned about. One is 5 years old, and one is 35, and I'm most concerned about the 35-year-old. And at that point, her husband picked up a toddler, started crying, and left the room. And she just said to me, I don't know how to help my husband. So what happens is you see regression in adults, too. So it's not just bedwetting and biting your fingernails when you had, got a little bit older. You see it in adults, and you see it among healthcare professionals, and we see it among school personnel. So one of the things we ask is have the teachers stop yelling at the kids more. So that sometimes is a several month later milestone that we'll see after a shooting in schools. So you just see that people become irritable, cranky, less tolerant of change, less tolerant of other people's needs, and you will see that among your peers if you're involved in a crisis or disaster. So you just have to be kind of attentive to that. As you can imagine, kids, just like adults, can get saddened by these events, and may have depression, and sometimes it'll manifest as avoidance of previously enjoyed activities. They don't want to go out with their friends anymore. They don't want to go to concerts. And you really need to work with them to get them back with their peers. Substance use, you can see an increase in alcohol and tobacco use. That's been, for example, that was documented on the East Coast after 9/11. Seen them after other disasters. And I've seen them among professionals. So during one of my trips to New Orleans, the person who was hosting my visit, who was a mental health professional, told me after my presentation, she said, there's something you mentioned, and I really should tell you this story because it's happened to me. It was a couple of weeks after Katrina, and I got a call on my cell phone from my daughter. She asked where I was, and I said, I'm at the bar near the school, and it's happy hour. And she said, Mom, you've been at happy hour every day since Katrina, and you don't seem happy. And she just looked at me and she goes, I was drinking a lot, and I didn't even make the connection until my daughter called me on it. And that's when I kind of was like, how is that going now? Because she was driving at the time. It's over. You're safe. I'm like, okay, thank you. I just, you do have to protect yourself as well. So the next thing that's listed there is somatization. So a lot of kids and adults who really have emotional distress will present with physical complaints. And so we do a lot of work with school-based health clinics and school nurses because they get inundated after these events. And they do in communities that have a high rate of violence, for example. A lot of what they get is going to be emotional distress, but it comes in as physical complaints. And so we really have to work with kids and families to make the connection so that we can start to attend to the real underlying cause. So this slide just kind of summarizes, because a lot of my work is with schools, about what you can expect to see in schools after a school crisis in the absence of an intervention. Although I'm going to be honest, you're going to see this even if you do everything I suggest, you're still going to see some of this, but hopefully less. So one thing you see is a drop in cognitive functioning and academic achievement. I went into one school, and after a major school shooting, and the teachers were telling me that the kids were about 2 to 3 years behind a couple months afterwards. One of them looked at me and she said, I'm in I can't remember what grade, I think it was 3rd or 4th grade, and she taught math. She said, they don't remember how to read a ruler. I actually had to go back and teach them how to use a ruler. And so what you really have to do is reset your expectations to where the kids are and go back to the level they're functioning at and bring them forward. And so this is because of trouble with anxiety, difficulty concentrating, sleep problems, depression. All of those make it very hard to concentrate. You'll see an increase in absenteeism because of school avoidance. and an increase in suspensions and expulsions because of the irritability that people get when they're under stress, the social regression, and the substance use. So either they come to school and they're thrown out, they don't come to school, or they come to school and they don't learn. That's a lot of the kids will fit into that category. And when you add all of that together, the graduation rate drops. So I summarize it this way because it's less now, but it used to be more so. I would get called by someone in the school. I'd meet with a school administrator and they'd say, well, you know what? We're not trained in doing this. Parents will help their kids recover. It's really the community's event. You know, like there's a flooding or something, and they go, it's really a community event, and families are in the best position to support their children. We're in the business of educating kids, and it's really not what we do. So then I tell them, fine. I don't think it's fine, so I don't actually say that. I said, but if that's how you feel, that the only thing you're here for is to educate kids, I will tell you you're not going to be successful in doing it unless you help them cope. So I tell them that taking time in schools to help children adjust to disaster and its aftermath is essential to promote academic achievement. And this is not just after major disasters. It's in response to a suicide of someone in their community, a fact that their parents are getting divorced, whatever is the stressor for the child. If we don't help them with that, we really can't expect them to learn very much. So it becomes what they have to do. So how many of you haven't heard about PTSD? Okay, so I'm going to go quickly because that's the situation is most people have heard about it. This is according to DSM-5, so the newest criteria. So to qualify for PTSD, according to current criteria now, the child has to have had an exposure to death, serious injury, or sexual violence. Now, the new criteria allow that exposure not only to be a personal exposure, they watch someone get killed, or they are personally injured, or witnessing, that's what it used to be. Now it also is if they have been informed of the death or serious injury of a parent or other family member. So right away now, that's going to be every kid with bereavement. So that all they have to do is be informed that something bad happened, which I think is lowering the bar very far. You're going to get a lot of people into PTSD territory. So then they have to have the next four components. So re-experiencing of the traumatic event is one of them, and that can be through recurrent, intrusive, and distressing memories, or just recurrent distressing dreams. And in children, they can have scary dreams and not even remember what the dreams are about, and it will be presumed to be due to the traumatic event and meet the criteria for re-experiencing. So if a kid's parent dies in a car accident and they're told about it and they don't sleep well for a couple days and they said, I had scary dreams, they will meet that criteria now for PTSD, even if they weren't at the event and don't even know how their parent died. They can also, though, have dissociative reactions like flashbacks. That is seen more in adults than children. It's not required in kids. And they can also have post-traumatic play. That if they play out or reenact the event repeatedly, then that is a sign of re-experiencing and is sufficient. Kids also, so that's one component. The next one is avoidance of stimuli associated with the trauma. They don't want to think about it or talk about it. Well, they don't want to think about or talk about things that upset them in general. So bereavement would fit into that category as well. One point I want to stress about this is one of the core criteria is avoidance of any stimuli, including thinking or talking about it. So as a result, people with PTSD do not want to think or talk about it. And so they do not tell you about it often. So you can have individuals who are symptomatic of PTSD and not know about it for months, years, and I've heard of decades. So the issue is you have to inquire about stressful events if you want to find out PTSD. They may be reluctant and avoid it, but often they will tell you if you ask them. But you have to at least ask or screen. They also need to have negative alterations in cognitions and mood. The negative alterations in cognitions can be that they have a distorted understanding of why it happened and they feel guilty. I talk about bereavement a lot. That's almost universal. The kids will feel guilty after a death has occurred. Or a negative alteration of mood, they feel sad, anxious. So I think it's pretty much a given that almost everyone who goes through traumatic experience is going to appear to qualify for that criteria. And then they have a state of increased arousal, which can be trouble concentrating or sleeping, irritability or anger, self-destructive behavior, hypervigilance or exaggerated startle. But difficulty concentrating is seen in kids with bereavement all the time. So I'm going through this because you could take a child whose parent died of natural causes, and I'm suspecting that the vast majority of them will now qualify for PTSD. everybody will soon qualify for PTSD. That is not that PTSD isn't a problem, but there is a tendency for us to start to label everything as trauma symptoms and trauma disorders, and that isn't helpful to people. There's a wide range of reactions and concerns, and it's not just PTSD. So I worked in New York City after 9/11 for several years, helping the school system respond. And what I was struck by was in New York City, all 5 boroughs, there wasn't a single pediatric bereavement center. You can get anything in New York City on any block at any hour, but you couldn't get a pediatric bereavement center. There's one there now. But you have to ask yourself, why is that? And for a lot of the kids, there were thousands of children who lost a parent on the same day. And for most of those kids, there were some kids that I was in schools that were right next to the World Trade Center, and the kids watched people jump from the towers. They had traumatic symptoms. But for kids whose parent died, and they were in Queens at the time, and they heard about it later in the day that their dad was a firefighter and died, it really didn't matter whether or not the dad was killed by a plane that hit a tower that they were in, or was killed in a car accident on the way to work. The real issue was the kid's dad was dead and wasn't going to come home. So to keep talking about what happened that day and the trauma of being informed, miss sight of the fact that really a lot of those kids were just dealing with bereavement and they weren't getting any support. So when I was in Joplin, I talked with it was a young adult who was in the movie theater where the shooting occurred, and the individual on either side of him was shot and killed, and he wasn't hit by a bullet. And he got pulled out quickly and didn't really know what was going on. But he wouldn't return to school. He wouldn't take phone calls from friends, and he refused to go for counseling. So we went and visited him in his home. And he said, I don't want to talk about it. I don't want to go for trauma counseling. I'm not having post-traumatic reactions. And so he said he had left his house with his friends who were at the movie theater with him. He said, they understand what's going on. We've been out. I'm sleeping better now. I don't startle the way I used to. I'm eating okay. I'm not having trauma symptoms. I said, so then why aren't you at school? And he goes, I don't feel all right. There's something missing. I just feel things are wrong. And so as we talked, a girl that he grew up with was one of the people murdered. And so when I said, do you think maybe it's that you miss your friend? Because he went to the movie with her. And he said, that's it. And he said, so if you give me someone who will help me with that, I'll go for counseling then. But no one offered him bereavement support. Everybody wanted to talk about the shooting. And he had the sense to know that wasn't his issue. Now, obviously there are people in the movie theater who have post-traumatic reactions. But we cannot assume that everyone who has been through a crisis or disaster has trauma symptoms that explains all of their needs. So I'm going to show you one clip. It's only 2 minutes long, maybe 2.5 minutes. It's interviews that I conducted of kids a couple years ago in preparation for a webinar that I did for Scholastic, for teachers on how to support grieving students. All of these kids experienced the death of their father 1 to 9 years beforehand. And I just want to give a little bit of a voice about some of the kids' sense.
Loss is something that's very hard to describe in words. I wasn't paying attention in class a lot. Whenever they would ask me the question, I would be spaced out.
Once or twice I would bring up my dad, and then everybody would be like, oh, do you want to talk about something else? A lot of people stayed away from me, didn't really talk to me a lot.
A lot of my teachers actually do not do a lot, which is not helpful at all. It makes you feel kind of awkward, makes you feel very, very alone.
Teachers don't understand that even though it was a long time ago, it's still really hard for me.
All the books that you pick up and read talk about how to handle a student in the first year, but very rarely do they address, okay, now this year is done, how are we going to handle them for the rest of the time? Because it doesn't go away, and kids don't get over it.
There was no training for loss or tragedy in my principalship training, and I always felt as if it was something that was really needed.
I think that some part of the lesson plan should be geared toward understanding grief, understanding when a parent dies, how the child may feel.
It's really important that the student kind of be guided to where they can go just in case they need to talk to someone.
So in that beginning of the clip, you saw an adolescent boy said it was hard for him to concentrate in class. Well, he got labeled as learning disabled. And I have another clip where his mother said, I think the issue is really he's struggling with the fact that his father was murdered. I mean, so the issue is this, I'm sure he was having trouble learning. I'm not questioning that. And I'm not even questioning whether he had a learning disability as well. Maybe it was made worse by the grief. But the point is that grief really is, in and of itself, a difficult experience for kids and something we should help them with, but too often something that gets overlooked. But it's not as if that would be bad enough. It's not just trauma, it's not just bereavement, it's everything else that happened. So when I was out in the Gulf Coast, I remember I was there about a year afterwards on one of the visits, and somebody said, when are these kids going to get over this? And I'm like, well, it hasn't ended yet. Most of the kids are not back at their schools. They're not in permanent safe housing. A lot of people have unemployment or underemployment. There's an increase in mental health issues and domestic violence. They can't get over it until it ends, and even then it takes a while. So the issue is these kids have all these secondary losses and stressors. So it can start with an illness in a family member, and it can lead to loss of job in someone, financial insecurity, loss of housing. So in New Orleans, for example, they had relocations, the loss of their peer network, the network of supportive adults, their whole community in many cases. Kids were relocated to other schools and started to fail. There's one kid that I heard about who was in a school, a magnet school for gifted children, and it flooded. He was relocated. He struggled in the new school. They labeled him as intellectually disabled, put him in a full-time special ed class. Not surprisingly, he didn't do well there because he wasn't going to pay attention to that curriculum. And he continued to fail even in full-time special ed. The school was rebuilt. He went back into a school for gifted kids where he was reunited with his friend and people who were supportive to him, and he started to do well. So we found that they had trouble integrating into new social networks. There was increased bullying going on, financial stresses among the parents, parental stress, domestic violence, all of these other things. And so when kids come into the clinic to see you or into the hospital, you're not just trying to find out what happened that was the traumatic event. It's everything that followed that event. It's what they're dealing with now. And what they're dealing with now can be overwhelming. So I'm sure it completely overwhelmed you with all of the stuff that can happen. So I'm going to make it even worse. So it's not that you deal just with one crisis. One crisis tends to awaken feelings related to pre-existing or past crisis. And that, even if the event is unrelated, can be what the person focuses on. I went to one school that had had a shooting, an accidental shooting of an elementary school student that died. And I was talking with the teachers about how to support kids that are grieving. And one of the teachers started sobbing, and I had to stop the workshop and find out what was going on. And she disclosed to everyone there, all of her colleagues, that she had miscarried 20 years ago and hadn't told anyone yet. And you go in, the bottom line is, you go in to deal with an event, no matter how bad it is, you're not just dealing with that. You're dealing with everything bad that has ever happened to anyone in that group. And it is not just the families. It's also the professional staff. So I've had this where even individuals that I'm working with who do trauma work, so I did one training, and we were doing a tabletop activity, and the person who I'm talking about wrote it with me. And so instead of talking about a school shooting, we talked about a car accident, because I thought, well, this community had a lot of school shootings, so let's talk something that's more generic. And right as we're about to process it with the group, she looks at me and she goes, I can't stay, and she leaves. And I'm like, okay, what was that? Her brother died in a car accident. She didn't share it with me beforehand. But right when she went to talk about it, she didn't feel she could. And she was the co-facilitator. So, I mean, the issue is you uncover everything in people's lives. And related to that, future events can lead to a resurgence of your feelings, so that if you listen to the 911 tape about Newtown, it can unsurface the time you got a bad phone call about a car accident and a family member 7 years ago. So these events, you bring them forward into your future, and they make you more vulnerable for having a resurgence of these feelings when there's been a crisis. So I often tell this one story. I was working with one school system. The kids were going on a field trip. They were high school students. They were in the bus, and one of the girls was wearing a necklace she got as a gift and had a little bottle and some liquid in it. I think she was just curious, so she opened it up and did not realize it was a personal protective device. It has the liquid concentrate that's in pepper spray. You're supposed to open it when you're attacked. Would have been good to know beforehand. So she opens it up on the bus, and kids start getting overwhelmed. Some kids, I think, started vomiting. Some kids had asthma attacks. People didn't know what it was. They stopped the bus. They went into a burger place. They contaminated the restaurant. And the next thing they know, they're dialing, they were going to do an on-site mass decontamination of everyone in the restaurant. Not just the kids, but anyone who went in to get a burger that day was going to be stripped naked and hosed down. So finally, the girl kind of said, no, it's me. Like, I think finally she reached a threshold where, you have to admit it, otherwise the alternative is worse. So they they realized it wasn't a sarin attack or any other chemical decontamination required emergently. So they put the kids in a clean bus. They took them to a children's hospital. They kept them in the bus until the girls went one by one to take a shower in one shower. The boys went one by one to another shower. The adults left and went into the hospital to get showered indoors. Nobody saw anyone naked. And they had clean new clothing that was donated. They got dressed in their new clothes. They were brought to an auditorium where they showed cartoons. They had cookies and punch, and social work and child life specialists sat with them to help them process the event until their parents picked them up within an hour. One girl lost a boot. Okay, that was it. And they got a new set of clothes. So I'm thinking that will never happen again. You will never be able to do a decontamination that way. So the school is talking to me, it's like a couple weeks later, and they go, what did we do wrong? And I go, why would you ask what did you do wrong? That was so over the top. I mean, cookies and punch cartoons and child life specialists is really beyond what you ever expect in a decontamination. And she said there are two girls and they won't return to school. They have panic attacks and they can't come to school anymore. What did we do wrong? I said, stop asking about what you did wrong. You just uncovered something else. I haven't met the kids. I just based on the stories. I said, there's nothing that you did wrong. Find out about these girls' lives. There's something you uncover. So one girl, they didn't know much about her. She only been in the school for a week. She transferred in because her mother was murdered a week prior. That's why she was having panic attacks. It had nothing to do with the decontamination. The other girl, they kept telling me for about a week or two, there isn't anything. We've asked. We keep asking. And I said, keep asking more. There's something you haven't found yet. It's in her personal life. She was being sexually assaulted by her father. And it took a couple weeks until she finally felt safe to disclose that information. So the issue is, you go in to deal with the decontamination, you're dealing with sexual assault, you're dealing with everything else. I went into one school where a student had sex with an educator in the school. I don't remember the details. And that had become public knowledge. And that was the crisis for the school. And so I looked at the principal and I said, okay, do you have a hotline for a sexual assault hotline? I go, it was only one student. And I said, oh no, I wasn't talking about the kids. I'm talking about your staff. Good chance that a number of your staff, statistically female more than male, but could be male too, were sexually assaulted sometime in their life. This is a good time to remind them of what a sexual assault phone number is and where they can get counseling and support. And go, they're not going to actually, I remember the principal was going, they're not really going to ask me that. And I go, well, if you're not supportive, no, they won't. But if you are supportive, then you may hear about it. And so I would just suggest you give that information. It's good to anticipate that. I came back the next day and he looked at me and goes, 3. And so the issue is, if you're prepared, this happens. It's a standard thing. So it's overwhelming. So you would think, okay, all these kids must look upset. But they don't. So this was, Project Liberty put these up in New York City about 6 months after 9/11 because the kids don't look upset. They often withhold their complaints. And parents in general underestimate symptoms, particularly about emotional distress. They can see their behaviors, but they can't tell how they're feeling. And children may withhold their complaints because of concerns that it makes them abnormal, or they want to protect their parents who are visibly upset. Or parents may not think the professionals are interested in hearing about it. Like, why would they call their pediatrician and say, my kid's struggling with a traumatic event? It's not what they do. And I don't know if people have heard the expression, it's just a normal reaction to an abnormal event in crisis situations. It's in a lot of the lay literature that people hand out. I really don't like that expression worded that way. Because the only way I can assume people interpret that in general is it's what everybody else is going through, suck it up and deal with it. How, if you say it's just, often it's said, it's just a normal reaction to an abnormal event. Do you need counseling? Well, the people who say yes generally have been in counseling for a long time and not benefited from it, so they're asking for more. And the ones who actually need it are going to say, no, I don't need it. So it's a decent question if you reverse code it. But I'm being a little flip on that. But the issue is it's not a good way of phrasing it. So what I prefer to say is even emotionally healthy individuals who find themselves in a situation such as yours will often experience distress that can be helped by supportive services. Will you allow me to give you that support? And individuals, I think, are much more likely to say, yes, I'd appreciate that. But if you say, do you actually need it? It's just a normal reaction. I don't know how they're supposed to say yes to that. So I think it's a good idea, but I think we have to be a little cautious about how we word it. And we have to realize there's so much stigma related to mental illness. It doesn't go away after a disaster, and people are still reluctant to get help. So let me turn to the timeline. In the next just 3 minutes, I want to go over the timeline and professional self-care issues. So if you think about adjustment over time, we all have a baseline from A to B. And it's not a straight line. We have good days where things happen, a patient gets sick or has a bad outcome, we dip. Family writes you a nice note about how helpful you were, you feel elated for a period of time. So it's not a straight line. But a bad event occurs, a crisis occurs at point B, and that's when people are just overwhelmed. So at point C, they're vulnerable, and at D, their usual coping mechanisms have failed. If they were able to cope with it, it's not called a crisis. It's called then a bad event. But it's a crisis when you're overwhelmed. So at point D, people are overwhelmed, and then people come together and provide support. And usually by E and F, people start to improve. But you have to be very careful about the people that are at point E to F. Because for some of those individuals, they will have made some improvement, so they're not feeling immobilized. But they look and they see where their baseline was, and they question if they will ever make it back to their baseline. And that's when you see suicides occurring among people in communities that have been affected by events. I've also seen it in school shootings, where kids then start with suicide. And the issue is that often, and whenever we see any improvement, a week, 2 weeks later, we say, look, the kids stopped crying. Go back to routines. Kids love routine. They do like routines with adaptation, but that doesn't mean we withdraw their support, because we leave them very vulnerable. And what I found when I went to New Orleans, about 4 months after Katrina, individuals in the healthcare field could list adults they knew who had died by suicide. There was a supplement, Pediatrics, dedicated to a young pediatrician who killed himself after Katrina in New Orleans. So what you will see is that's a very vulnerable period. So what we have to do is continue to support up until the point when people are back at their baseline. If we stop beforehand, some individuals, children and adults, will simply have a new baseline. I just call it continued impairment. They don't get back, and they may never get back. So we have to support them until they get back to their baseline. And for some individuals, if they are able to cope effectively and have enough internal resilience and external support, they may actually exceed their baseline. And that's what we call post-traumatic growth, where individuals emerge from a difficult situation with new coping skills and strategies that they can apply for future adversity. And there is future adversity in everyone's life. And they are in a better position to help. They may also have a new insight of spiritualism or a new value, which values connectedness with other people, for example, or community need. I was doing one presentation a couple months ago in New Jersey for foster care parents. And one of the foster care parents just, right at this point, just raised his hand and goes, "It's me." And I'm like, "What's you?" And he looks at me and he goes, "That's me. I didn't realize I had post-traumatic growth. I had a child who was 4 months old and died of meningitis about 9 months ago. I quit my job on Wall Street, and I'm an elementary school teacher now, and I am a foster care parent, and I'm adopting a baby." He said, "I guess that's post-traumatic growth. I never thought of it that way." So he said he really did what he thought was important. He reassessed what his values were, and that's great. A lot of people in medicine, and I spend time on this, are in that category. So read the essays you get from medical school, residency. It's usually in the personal statement in the first paragraph. When I was 8 years old, my sister died of leukemia, and I decided I wanted to be a pediatrician. Now, the post-traumatic growth is good. It's better than a continued impairment. Problem is, I also told you that future crisis events uncover past ones. So that means we are vulnerable to having that uncovered when we see other adversity. And guess what? That's what we do for a living. So we are going to see it, and it comes forward. So that's the last thing I want to say was the importance of professional self-care. We need to recognize it's distressing to be with kids who are in distress. A lot of times when I ask pediatricians, why do you go into pediatrics? They say, because kids get better. And I'm like, well, not all of them. And in fact, the ones you're caring for are the ones that don't. And so it's the same way when I ask doctors, why do you go into medicine? And they go, because I want to make sure people don't die. I'm like, okay, bulletin for you. The death rate equals the birth rate. They all die. I mean, the only thing we can do is go into pediatrics and keep them alive until they turn 18 and transfer them abruptly to medicine. Let them die then. But that's not really great. So we have to find ways to have our own personal needs met and appreciate and address the impact of supporting kids who are grieving or traumatized, and create a culture where it's okay to be upset when upsetting things happen, and that we normalize asking for help and accepting assistance. So I just put this up here. I have a National Center for School Crisis and Bereavement. We have a number of different resources. They're all free. You can find it at schoolcrisiscenter.org. One of the things is really a parent guide that you can get for free at nylgriefguide.com. You can order hard copies in English and Spanish. You can also download PDFs and electronic copies. You can freely reproduce them. And they actually will even pay the shipping and handling for you to get hard copies of them. So anyone can order them for free. And we also have guidelines for addressing the death of a student or staff in school. We have a separate one for suicide. There's psychological first aid documents, guidance on dealing with anniversaries. We even have a training module on bereavement. And the American Academy of Pediatrics has a number of the same resources. They link up to our website, and there are additional ones that they have as well. I'll leave those websites up. So I'm just going to stop now. I have a couple minutes for questions. Yes?
I was wondering, if you answer a question about a situation I think some of our colleagues may have stuff in, I probably have already. I was taking care of a kid.
Or during. Edna.
I hadn't anticipated that, and I certainly wouldn't have talked to them about it. And so in all of things that well, quite honestly, I don't know. But he's not here, but I don't know if we had a better.
Sure. Children generally ask questions when they're ready for the answers. Not always, but generally. So what I would do is, what you did was very good. You didn't lie to the child or mislead him, and you don't know where he was, and you don't know what happened. It reminds me of a case that I was involved in some years ago, where there was a girl, she was with her brother in the back seat. Her parents were killed in the car accident at the scene. They were pronounced dead. The brother was transferred to another hospital. She came to our hospital. Both were intubated. Neither of them had major injuries, so they were able to be extubated fairly shortly thereafter. The girl was the one I worked with, and she was about 8. She was Korean and had only been in the country a couple of years, I think. And so the Korean culture was an important part of the response that we had. But what happened was they asked me the same question, what's going to happen when we extubate her, because they're about to extubate her. And she asked what happened to her parents. I said, you should tell them that she was in a car with her brother and both of her parents. She was in a serious car accident. Her brother is in another hospital recovering. Her parents were seriously injured. And her aunt and uncle are coming in to talk to her, which is accurate. And then they said, well, what if she asks, are my parents alive? You can then say, your aunt and uncle are coming in to talk with you about it. And they said, but what if she asks us? Then she's telling you she's ready for the answer, and you need to tell her. Because although she wasn't seriously injured, she had fractured her hip, she had fractured her jaw, so it was wired closed. I mean, she was really unable to sit up, had trouble talking, And so she asked, and they told her, and she didn't ask any further. And then her aunt and uncle came in and they said, and this was the cultural issues, they said, we can't tell her parents are dead or her heart might break and she will die. I said, well, she's in an intensive care unit. So, I mean, seriously, we're watching her, we're supporting her. We need to be honest. And so I held the aunt and uncle's hands and they told the kids, told the girl. The boy was in another major teaching hospital that I won't mention, and they had psychiatry involved, and psychiatry said not to tell him that his parents were dead. And so the aunt and uncle came in. So the girl was very appropriate. So I remember she looked at me, and I came each day and I met with her and talked with her. And at one point she looked at me, she goes, it's going to be Father's Day this weekend, and I know you don't come in on the weekend. Could you come in and be with me? I said, yes, I will do that for you. And then she asked them to videotape the funeral, because in the Korean culture it was very important to be there, and she couldn't because of her injuries. So she watched the video of her dad's and mother's funeral in the hospital. I came in to spend Father's Day. Her brother wasn't told what happened. So, and his injuries were less, and he was 2 years older. So what she did on her own, I did not suggest this to her, she was worried about her brother. She called him. I don't know how she got an outside line, but she called her brother from her bed in the hospital and told him over the phone that the parents were dead. He was able to understand it. He was not confused. I think that's unfortunate because he didn't get to go to the funeral either. He wouldn't have been able to, but the aunt and uncle were pretending that the parents were alive in one hospital and bringing in the tape of the funeral to the other. I just think that's a horrible burden to place on them. But fortunately, the girl made it good, and she reached out to her brother. So you have to remember that when kids get really upset by this news, they're not upset by your telling them. They're upset because their parents are dead. And so all you're doing is allowing them to share the feelings that they have. So it's better if a family member is there. So I think the way you handled it is good, but there's no real good way. And that's the other thing I will say. People ask how I do this work or why I do it. Part of the reason for doing it is because when you go through these events and you're the leader, like you're the principal or superintendent of the school system that's at a mass casualty event, it doesn't matter how well you do it, it doesn't feel like you've done a good job. Because people are crying, they're upset, kids are dead, it just feels horrible. And to have someone there who can say, and I've done this with people in major events and said, no matter how you do this, it's not going to feel like you've done it well. I want you to trust that you are actually doing a good job, as best as anyone could humanly in this situation. And they'll look at me and go, that is so helpful. And so I think that's one of the ways that outsiders can help in these events. So if you feel like it didn't, like the kid was still upset, it's just going to be. So you're actually holding her hand? Yeah, or holding his hand is very helpful. So I know that we're now a couple minutes over, so if people wish to leave, please feel free to, and I can stay and answer a couple other questions from